Hello and welcome to the New World Review, your source for everything anime and manga. And today, it's time to give my final thoughts on the Demon Slayer anime. Now, as I've already addressed in my prior video about this series, I know that I was, very late to the party, but on the plus side, I got to binge most of it over a couple of days, which I tell you was a hell of an experience. And I have to say that I am incredibly glad that I eventually decided to pick this up. This series very much exceeded my expectations in almost all areas, be it story, characters, animation, music, and the list goes on and on and on. So overall, I do think that Demon Slayer was a very schmick and solid product with a lot of potential for future adaptations. And while I'd like to give Ufotable as much credit as possible for their work, I must recognize that the only way they were able to elevate a series to this level was to start with a very good core product in the manga, which I'm going to begin reading pretty much immediately. But with that said, coming at this from the perspective of an as of right now anime only watcher, I'd have to say that the characters were very much the key feature that hooked me on this series. Tanjiro in particular is a great protagonist. He dangles quite dangerously on the line of being a generic shonen main character, but any time that I felt he was about to fall into mediocrity, he immediately elevated himself because he possesses qualities that few shonen protagonists sport, and those that do, for the most part, don't convey them convincingly enough. A great example of this is that Tanjiro, just by being himself, has a huge impact on those around him. Everyone who encounters this boy ends up being changed in some way, whether it's becoming more driven or coming to some sort of profound realization. And this sort of storytelling is very, very dangerous actually, because if done incorrectly, it can make the protagonist seem incredibly unrealistic and more of a way for the author to insert themselves into a world where they are always the best at everything possible and admired by all characters around them. And my primary example of this sort of storytelling is always the book Ready Player One, where the protagonist always has the answer to every problem and everyone around him is just constantly high-fiving how cool and resourceful he is. Demon Slayer manages to take that idea and portray it much more convincingly by giving Tanjiro a hell of a lot of emotional weight, and while all those around him do come to admire, respect, or at the very least acknowledge him in some way, those feelings are well and truly earned, and generally not through a single action either, but through a series of actions that come to endear characters to him. In fact, I'd say that Tanjiro has a very Luffy-like quality about him. He's someone who can traverse this world and constantly be capable of winning people over, not by being the best at anything, but by displaying his unrelenting natural determination. So I'm quite drawn to him and very keen to see how he progresses going forward. The other side of that coin though is of course Nezuko. So I said in my first impressions video that I hadn't really gotten to see enough of her to form a proper opinion, and in general I do wish that I'd gotten to see more of her in the series, because every time she was on screen she was a delight in some way. Nezuko has a wonderful mixture of adorable moments, spiced in with the same sort of admirable determination that characterizes her brother. And that really is the crux of the series for me. I love the idea of this partnership and the familial bonds because you almost never see it in a shonen series. In fact, family is generally the weakest element, with any parents or siblings, if they aren't dead, relegated to the background. But in Demon Slayer, family is the selling point. And despite the fact that most of Tanjiro's family are dead, they play an incredibly relevant role in the journey going forward. Like I mentioned in my episode 19 video, I love the fact that the only plausible way that they were able to overcome Rui was the idea of the power of familial bonds. Tanjiro inherits an upgrade from their father, and Nezuko is prompted by their mother, and only together, as a family unit, were they able to get the better of Rui. Although I am still glad that they weren't able to defeat him for good, because I do think that the series has some potential power scaling issues. In fact, something that makes me very nervous is the fact that every new encounter with a demon seems to make gigantic leaps of power, instead of presenting a more gradual increase. I mean, starting from the very beginning, humans are completely outclassed by one standard demon, who is completely outclassed by a big boy demon, who is nothing compared to the fake 12 Kizuki, who are nothing compared to Spider Daddy, who is absolutely nothing compared to Rui, who is assumedly absolutely nothing compared to the superpowered lower moon dude bruh, who is assumedly absolutely nothing compared to the upper moons, who are assumedly absolutely nothing compared to the King of Pop. It's a very minor issue, but something that has the potential to get out of control very quickly. There isn't a lot of middle ground, and in a lot of cases the current villain seems to possess completely godlike power compared to the previous. And as a result, it requires a better and better explanation as to how we are eventually able to defeat them, which has already begun to demand blatant power-ups. But to the credit of the series, it has been handled exceptionally well so far, but it does make me a little nervous for the future. Moving back to characters though, I very much enjoyed the eventual extended cast that were introduced, for the most part that is. I mean, starting with Zenitsu, this boy has me really conflicted. I both love and cannot stand him in equal measure. On the one hand, he's easy to empathize with because he's one of the more regular human characters in the series being thrust into situations that he is clearly not mentally prepared for. We've all been there. But at the same time, calm your farm. His gags are genuinely funny for the first couple of times, but the problem is, especially in the first few episodes he was in, he just never stops. He screams and screams and screams and screams and screams, and then takes a break to yell, but after that he screams and screams and screams, and then he'll do something cool. And to be fair, when he is in action, Zenitsu is an absolute highlight of the series. I love the idea that he can only perform one technique, and the whole concept of just mastering one thing in general, and it just looks so spectacular every time he performs it. Also, he has a lot of decent dramatic substance in his backstory and his struggle to get through life, but my god, do we have to sift through a lot of screaming and being a general pervert to get there. His sustained energy is just a bit too much for me, although to be fair, this did get better over the course of the series, and I feel like he ended up as a much more balanced character by the end. Then there's also Inosuke, and I thought I was going to have the same problem with him at first, because for an episode or two, all he did was yell and yell about wanting to fight, but he got over that really quickly and became a truly great and enjoyable character. He's a good all-rounder really, as he can do some great comedy, some phenomenal action with his amazing self-taught breathing, and he has a really super solid character design. Always a feast for the eyes and a charm for the mind. And of course, most of the tertiary cast also falls into that category. There were very few characters who were introduced in Demon Slayer that I just plain did not like, and actually I can't think of any off the top of my head. There may have been characters I felt indifferent about, like some of the more generic demons, but otherwise it was an incredible cast of individuals, because even those who got such small amounts of screen time had a decent impact on me. And I think this is especially true of the large majority of demons actually. One of the greatest assets Demon Slayer has is the humanization of these figures, who in more typical stories would generally be cast as evil for the sake of evil. But I love that these creatures who have done truly horrifying things, many of which was in front of our very eyes, can still garner sympathy from their human struggles and moments of realization. It generates a genuine connection between the antagonists of the series and the viewer, which is such a difficult bond to achieve, and in most cases I feel legitimate loss when these demons do meet their final demise. It makes me quite excited to move on and see further demons, because it would seem that the more powerful the foe, the more tragic a past they have, which I imagine will eventually culminate in Kibutsuji. And in that quest, as I've already stated, I will be pursuing the manga because I can't stand the idea of waiting God knows how long for another season. And that is a great credit to the anime adaptation, as well as the original product for coming together to completely hook me. But while we're on this, episode 26 had some good and some bad news. The good news being that a Demon Slayer film has been greenlit, picking up right where we left off. This sounds fantastic, cannot wait. However, the bad news is that a Demon Slayer film was given the green light, which means that a second series is but a faraway dream at the moment. And while that's a shame, I'm not really sure what more I could ask for, really. We've been given 26 episodes of a brilliant world, well-performed characters, and some nice little twists on what could have very easily been another generic shonen battle series. My favorite twist of which actually is the power system, which seems based almost entirely upon breathing. It's such a wonderful representation of what focus and correct technique can do to add potency, impact, and mastery over a martial art. It's not an easy system to sell though, and I actually imagine that the manga has a much more difficult time with this idea, but as a result of that difficulty, it is able to hit that much harder. It's not as simple as, say, magical powers, acquiring a quirk, building and molding energy, or even consuming a devil fruit. It's much more basic than that, and yet infinitely more complicated. And I just love the idea that, in theory, any human in this world could learn the techniques we see on display in the series purely through mastery of breath. It's not restrictive, however, as a result, it accepts only the very best, with brutal consequences for those deemed unworthy. So it is a pure triumph in that regard. However, with that said, Demon Slayer does occasionally fall into some shonen traps, one of which occurred right at the tail end of the anime when all of the Hashira were introduced together. Now, some people may not consider this a trap, but in my experience, it's never a great idea to introduce a large group of profound characters all at once. Firstly, because the bombardment of characters, whilst a great condensed experience for the viewer or reader at the time, doesn't really allow for individuals to get the attention they most certainly deserve, given their position, and secondly, because it removes a huge layer of intrigue going forward in the series. So for example, I really loved when I only knew of the existence of 2 Hashira. Not knowing how many of them existed nor what sort of crazy powers or designs they inhabited gave a nice air of mystery and made me want to explore this world infinitely to discover all of them. So it was slightly disappointing to have them all dumped on me all at once. But this is such a minor complaint, as is every negative aspect I've brought up in this review. None of the things I've mentioned are series breaking, and for a lot of people this might even be another selling feature. A ton of people might love Zenitsu's stupidly high energy, as well as being bombarded by high level characters, and that's great. It's just not my personal preference, but even with those things in mind, there is no way that I can come away from this anime with anything less than a glowing recommendation. I'm thrilled to have been on board with this journey, even if I did jump on a fair bit late. So as a result, it's been a fairly intense and condensed experience, but something that has reminded me of why I love the anime medium. And that pretty much does it for my final thoughts on Demon Slayer. If you enjoyed this video and the content this channel produced in general, then please do consider donating to the New World Review Patreon, because the support of all of you amazing people is what continues to make this channel possible. And if Patreon isn't quite your style, then please do leave this video a like, share, or subscribe, because it also helps support this channel an incredible amount. And if you'd like to join the fun at any time, then please do head over to my Discord server, where a wide array of shenaniganry takes place on a daily basis. And finally, please do comment with your thoughts on Demon Slayer. This has been the New World Review, and I'll see you next time.